March 6, 1967, Edwards Air Force Base, California, 110,000 feet above the Mojave Desert. The sky is no longer blue. It has thinned into something darker, colder, an indigo void that curves subtly at the edges, as if the earth itself is bending away beneath the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, Major William Pete Knight grips the control stick of an aircraft that does not truly belong to the atmosphere at all. The instrument panel vibrates violently. Warning lights flicker, then steady. Outside the reinforced glass canopy, the horizon is no longer straight. It is curved. Below him, the desert is silent and impossibly far away. Above him, space is waiting. At precisely 10:34 a.m., the North American X-15A2 ignites its XLR-99 rocket engine, unleashing 57,000 pounds of thrust in a machine barely longer than a fighter jet. The acceleration is brutal. Knight is slammed back into his seat with a force that crushes breath from lungs and presses blood into muscle. The engine burns liquid oxygen and anhydrous ammonia, a volatile chemical cocktail that turns the aircraft into a controlled missile. The climb angle steepens, 30 degrees, then 45, then nearly vertical. In less than 2 minutes, the X-15 punches through altitudes that strategic bombers will never reach, altitudes that spy planes only flirt with. Mach 3. Mach 4, Mach 5. The aircraft screams past Mach 6, more than 4,500 miles per hour. At Soviet radar stations thousands of miles away, faint anomalies begin to appear, returns that make no sense, objects climbing too fast, too steep, too high. In a windowless command room outside Moscow, junior radar officers exchange uneasy glances. This is not a missile trajectory, it is not a satellite launch, and it is moving horizontally at hypersonic speed. Something is flying where nothing should be able to fly. Back in California, the X-15's black Inconel X heat-resistant skin glows dull red from friction, temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no conventional control anymore. The air is too thin. Knight switches to reaction control thrusters, small hydrogen peroxide jets that puff like miniature rockets, allowing him to fly using the same principles as a spacecraft. For a moment, just a moment, the aircraft is weightless. The engine cuts off. Silence. The X-15 coasts upward on pure momentum, arcing higher and higher until it crosses the invisible boundary that men argue over, but pilots feel in their bones: space. Over 50 miles above Earth, the sky turns black. Stars appear in daylight. The earth below is unmistakably round. Major Knight has left the atmosphere in a plane. This is not supposed to be possible. And the Soviets know it. Across the Iron Curtain, elite pilots of the Soviet Air Forces, men who fly MiG-21s and MiG-25 prototypes at the edge of survivability, are briefed in stark rooms with peeling paint and the smell of stale tobacco. Intelligence summaries are thin, cautious, almost embarrassed. The Americans, it says, have flown a manned aircraft into space. Not a rocket capsule, not a ballistic hop, a plane. Colonel Yuri Gagarin had orbited Earth 6 years earlier, sealed inside a Vostok capsule with no real control, no wings, no landing gear. That was the Soviet triumph, but this is something else entirely. A reusable craft, piloted, landed on a runway. Soviet test pilots, men hardened by loss and secrecy, are stunned into silence. How does it land, one asks. No one answers. The X-15 program is officially experimental, wrapped in layers of classified language. Unofficially, it is a declaration of technological dominance. Designed by North American Aviation, launched from the wing of a B-52 Stratosport, the X-15 is not part of NASA's glossy public space race. It belongs to the Air Force, to the shadow world of military research, where the ultimate question is not exploration, but control. Control of altitude, control of speed, control of space. As Knight begins his descent, the aircraft re-enters the upper atmosphere at hypersonic velocity. The nose dips slightly too steep. Plasma blooms around the fuselage. The X-15 starts to oscillate, dangerously. This is where pilots die. Knight fights the controls with measured precision, adjusting angles by fractions of a degree. Too shallow, and he'll skip off the atmosphere like a stone on water, lost forever. Too steep, and the heat will tear the aircraft apart. On the ground, engineers watch telemetry scroll across green-lit screens. No one speaks. The Soviets are watching too, through signal intelligence, through whispered reports, through the growing realization that the Americans have built something fundamentally different. While Soviet doctrine favors brute force, bigger rockets, heavier missiles, the X-15 represents finesse, precision, adaptability, a weaponized philosophy. By the time the X-15 drops back into denser air, it is no longer a spacecraft, but it is not yet an airplane. Knight transitions controls again, guiding the scorched black craft toward Rogers Dry Lake, an ancient lakebed turned natural runway. The landing gear deploys. Dust rises. The X-15 touches down hard, but intact, skidding to a stop in a cloud of sand and silence. One man has flown into space and come back in a plane. And on the other side of the world, Soviet pilots and engineers are beginning to understand something terrifying. The rules of air combat and space itself have just changed. The dust has not yet settled on Rogers Dry Lake when the shockwave reaches Moscow. It arrives not with an explosion, but with silence, an absence of explanation that terrifies Soviet planners far more than any confirmed weapon. Inside the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, TSAGI, engineers pore over intercepted telemetry fragments, radar plots, and overheard American radio chatter. Nothing fits established models. No Soviet aircraft can climb that fast, that high, and return intact. No rocket can maneuver like that and land on wheels. This machine has wings. At Chkalovsky Air Base, northeast of Moscow, a closed-door briefing is convened. Present are senior officers of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO, test pilots from the MiG Design Bureau, and representatives from the KGB's First Chief Directorate. Cigarette smoke curls beneath fluorescent lights as grainy diagrams are pinned to a corkboard. Altitude, over 80 kilometers. Speed, Mach 6 plus. Propulsion, rocket-powered, reusable. One officer breaks the silence. "This is not aviation," he says flatly. "This is cosmonautics disguised as aviation." The distinction matters. Soviet doctrine is rigidly compartmentalized. Aircraft belong to the Air Force. Space belongs to the strategic rocket forces. The X-15 violates that separation completely. It moves between domains with ease, and worse, it does so under the control of a pilot. For Soviet test pilots, this is an insult as much as a threat. Men like Alexander Fedotov, future MiG-25 test legend, have risked their lives pushing Soviet aircraft to their absolute limits. They know what Mach 3 feels like. They know how thin the margin is between controlled flight and catastrophic failure. To imagine Mach 6 with a human at the controls feels reckless and impossibly advanced. How does the pilot survive the heat, one asks?
How does he control pitch without air? Another adds. The answers are uncomfortable. Advanced alloys, reaction control systems, a pilot trained not just as an aviator, but as an astronaut. The Americans have quietly merged two professions the Soviets keep separate. At OKB-155, the MiG Design Bureau, engineers begin dusting off radical concepts once dismissed as impractical. Spaceplanes, lifting bodies, rocket-assisted interceptors. Projects like Spiral, a Soviet spaceplane concept, are suddenly no longer theoretical indulgences. They are necessities. Meanwhile, Soviet pilots are summoned individually for quiet conversations. They are shown artists' impressions of the X-15. They are told what little is known. And then comes the question, asked carefully, almost casually. If such an aircraft were launched near our borders, could you intercept it? No one answers yes. Even the feared MiG-25, still in development, is designed to sprint to high altitude briefly, not to chase something that can leave the atmosphere entirely. Surface-to-air missiles are useless against a target that climbs vertically, then disappears above radar coverage. The X-15 has exposed a hole in Soviet defenses so large it feels existential. And it gets worse. American press releases, carefully sanitized, begin to appear. They frame the X-15 as a research program, a stepping stone to NASA's future. Smiling pilots pose for photographs. The aircraft is described as experimental, almost fragile. The Soviets know better. They have learned, painfully, that American experimental programs often hide operational intent. The U-2 was experimental until it was flying over Sverdlovsk. The SR-31 was experimental until it outran everything they had. Now comes an aircraft that can approach from above. At Zvezdny Gorodok, Star City, Soviet cosmonauts listen as engineers explain the implications. Yuri Gagarin himself is said to have shaken his head slowly during one briefing, murmuring that the Americans had found a way to fly into space without surrendering control. That is the heart of the fear. Soviet spacecraft are automated because they must be. Their systems cannot tolerate improvisation. The X-15, by contrast, thrives on it. Pilots like Knight and Neil Armstrong, yes, that Neil Armstrong, fly the X-15 by feel, making split-second decisions that no computer of the era could replicate. This means something profound. In a crisis, the Americans could adapt faster than doctrine allows. Soviet intelligence scrambles to learn more. Agents are tasked with infiltrating aerospace contractors. Analysts scour open-source journals for clues. Every scrap of information is hoarded, dissected, argued over. And slowly, an unsettling picture forms. The X-15 is not a weapon. It is worse. It is a test bed. A flying laboratory proving that controlled, piloted hypersonic spaceflight is not only possible, but repeatable. That means future vehicles will be larger, more capable, and potentially armed. Bombers that approach from near space, reconnaissance craft that cannot be intercepted, even orbital platforms that can be serviced by pilots, not capsules. The Americans are not racing to space. They are learning how to own the boundary between Earth and orbit. As one classified Soviet report concludes in chilling understatement, the United States has achieved a qualitative breakthrough in aerospace operations. Back at Edwards Air Force Base, the X-15 sits on the tarmac, scorched and scarred, technicians swarming over its blackened skin. To them, it is just another successful mission, data collected, limits pushed, records broken. They do not hear the conversations happening in Moscow. They do not see the unease settling over Soviet air bases. But the consequences of this flight are already spreading outwards, reshaping strategies, budgets, and dreams. The sky is no longer the limit, and the men who once believed speed and altitude alone to find power are beginning to realize they are standing at the edge of something entirely new.
At Ramenskoye Airfield, the unofficial heart of Soviet flight testing, the mood turns darker by the week. Here, the best pilots in the Soviet Union fly aircraft that exist nowhere else, bare metal prototypes with unpainted panels, engines pushed far beyond safe limits, wings that shudder violently at high Mach numbers. These men are not easily impressed. They have buried friends. They have ejected at the edge of consciousness. They have seen the sky try to kill them and gone back anyway. And yet, when the X-15 enters the conversation, their confidence falters. In a drafty briefing hall, a chalkboard is covered in altitude speed envelopes. Red lines mark the theoretical performance of the MiG-21, the Su-9, even the experimental Yi-266, what will one day become the MiG-25. Blue chalk traces the estimated climb profile of the American aircraft. The blue line leaves the board. "It goes where we cannot follow," one pilot mutters. The realization is humiliating. Soviet interceptor doctrine is built on reach, climb fast, strike hard, retreat. The X-15 renders that doctrine obsolete before it ever enters combat airspace. Launched from a B-52 far from danger, it climbs nearly vertically, accelerates beyond Mach 6, and disappears into near space where neither fighters nor missiles can touch it. Even if detected, even if tracked, there is no intercept solution. Colonel Fedotov runs the numbers himself. At maximum thrust, a MiG-25 might reach the lower edge of the X-15's flight path, but only briefly, and only if the American aircraft cooperates by flying predictably. The X-15 does not. Worse still, the Americans are flying it repeatedly. This is not a one-off stunt. Each mission refines procedures, trains pilots, expands envelopes. Men like Neil Armstrong, Joe Engel, and Pete Knight are learning how to handle hypersonic vehicles the way fighter pilots learn dogfighting, through experience. That terrifies Soviet planners. Experience cannot be stolen. It cannot be retro-engineered easily. It accumulates quietly, advantage compounding over time. In response, the Soviet Union accelerates its own radical programs. The spiral spaceplane receives renewed funding. Designers imagine a piloted orbital aircraft launched atop a booster, then returning to land like a conventional plane. On paper, it looks impressive. In reality, it is years behind and plagued by engine limitations, materials problems, and bureaucratic infighting. Meanwhile, pilots continue to ask the most basic question: what happens if it carries weapons? Officially, the X-15 does not. Unofficially, Soviet analysts cannot ignore its potential. A vehicle that could approach from near space could deploy reconnaissance sensors immune to interception, or worse, deliver a nuclear payload along an unpredictable trajectory. The uncertainty is destabilizing. At the Frunze Military Academy, instructors rewrite lectures. Altitude is no longer measured in kilometers alone. The vertical dimension, once theoretical, is now operational. Students are warned that future wars may begin not with bombers crossing borders, but with vehicles descending from above radar coverage. The psychological impact spreads beyond pilots and engineers. Political leadership takes notice. Defense budgets shift. Expectations change. And still, the X-15 keeps flying.
On one mission, it overshoots its landing site by hundreds of miles due to an inertial navigation error. Instead of panicking, Neil Armstrong manually flies the crippled craft back, dead-sticking across the desert to a safe landing. Soviet pilots read the debrief with disbelief. He flew it back. No automation saved him. No ground controller intervened. A man, alone in a machine half plane, half spacecraft, made decisions in real time at hypersonic speed and survived. That detail matters more than the altitude record, because it confirms what Soviet planners fear most. The Americans are not just building machines, they are building pilots who can operate beyond the boundaries of existing warfare. At Ramenskoye, one veteran test pilot sums it up quietly after a long day of calculations. He says, "We trained to master the sky. They trained to leave it." Outside, engines howl as another prototype screams down the runway, clawing for altitude that now feels insufficient. The chase continues, but the gap is widening, not closing. And deep within the Soviet system, an unspoken question begins to form. If the Americans can do this today, what will they fly tomorrow? By late 1967, the fear surrounding the X-15 is no longer confined to airfields and design bureaus. It has reached the Kremlin. Inside a fortified conference room, beneath portraits of Lenin and Marx, senior members of the Politburo listen as uniformed officers explain what cannot be easily countered. Charts show American flight profiles. Red circles mark Soviet radar blind zones. A thin blue arc, representing the X-15's trajectory, passes cleanly over them all. One official interrupts sharply. Is it a bomber? The answer is careful. Not yet. That word, yet, hangs in the air. The X-15 has not dropped bombs. It has not violated Soviet airspace. But its existence proves something far more dangerous than an act of aggression. The Americans now possess operational access to near space, and they are learning how to maneuver there at will. In military terms, space is no longer a sanctuary. For decades, Soviet defense planning assumed a clear separation. Aircraft were threats from below. Missiles were threats from above. The X-15 erases that distinction. It can be launched like an aircraft, climb like a missile, maneuver like neither, and return to be flown again. Reusable, piloted, precise. At Baikonur Cosmodrome, engineers responsible for Soviet rockets bristle at the implication. Their machines are powerful but inflexible. Once launched, they follow physics to the letter. The X-15 bends physics through control. That difference reshapes doctrine. New Soviet studies warn that future American vehicles may deploy reconnaissance cameras capable of photographing missile sites with impunity. Others speculate about fractional orbital weapons launched from piloted craft. Even if these fears are exaggerated, they drive urgency and paranoia. The irony is bitter. The Soviet Union reached space first, Sputnik, Gagarin, global prestige unmatched. Yet now the Americans appear to be mastering something subtler and arguably more useful. Spaceflight as an extension of air power, not a separate domain. Across the ocean, at Edwards Air Force Base, the pilots themselves sense the shift, though not always its geopolitical weight. To them, the X-15 is unforgiving, dangerous, and deeply personal. It does not tolerate mistakes. It does not forgive hesitation. Each mission is a negotiation with death. On November 15, 1967, tragedy strikes. Major Michael J. Adams loses control during re-entry. The X-15 enters a hypersonic spin. Structural loads exceed limits. The aircraft breaks apart at over 60,000 feet. Adams is killed instantly. The news reaches Soviet intelligence within days, and for the first time there is a flicker of grim recognition. This machine is not invincible. The Americans are paying for progress in blood, just as the Soviets have always done. But instead of slowing the program, the crash hardens American resolve. Flight resumes. Procedures are refined. Simulators are improved. Lessons are absorbed. From the Soviet perspective, this is perhaps the most alarming signal of all. The Americans are learning faster than they are losing. Soviet pilots, too, continued to die testing radical aircraft, but without the same accumulation of usable operational knowledge. Many Soviet projects stall, trapped between ministries, starved of materials, or buried under secrecy so deep it suffocates innovation. The X-15 thrives because it is allowed to fail and then fly again. By the end of the decade, Soviet analysts reach a quiet consensus. Even if they match the X-15 technically, they are unlikely to match its ecosystem, the integration of pilots, engineers, data, and rapid iteration. The battlefield has shifted upward, not to orbit, not fully, but to the thin, dangerous margin where air ends and space begins. And in that margin, the United States is alone.
By 1968, the X-15 is no longer just a program, it is a precedent. In Soviet intelligence summaries, a subtle change appears in the language. Early reports spoke of anomalous American experiments. Later ones speak of a new category of aerospace operation. Now the tone is resigned, almost admiring. The Americans have proven the concept. The question is no longer if it works, but what it leads to next. Soviet engineers try to answer that question by force of will. The Spiral program advances on paper, depicting a sleek orbital spaceplane launched by a hypersonic booster aircraft. Artists paint dramatic scenes of Soviet pilots descending from orbit, red stars gleaming on their wings. But behind the illustrations lie unsolved problems. Engines that cannot survive repeated heat cycles, materials that crack under thermal stress, guidance systems too crude for manual control at hypersonic speed. Most critically, there is no Soviet equivalent of the X-15 pilot culture. American X-15 pilots are a rare hybrid: combat aviators, test pilots, engineers, and astronauts in one. They sit in design meetings, they argue with engineers, they write notes directly onto schematics. When something feels wrong in flight, their judgment carries weight. In the Soviet system, pilots are operators, not partners. That difference proves fatal to imitation. At Star City, young cosmonauts train endlessly for orbital missions, procedural, automated, tightly scripted. They are brave, disciplined, and highly skilled, but they are not taught to experiment in the air. Soviet leadership fears improvisation almost as much as failure. The X-15, by contrast, is built around it. Each flight rewrites the rulebook. Each landing adds to a growing body of knowledge about hypersonic aerodynamics, re-entry physics, human endurance, and control beyond the atmosphere. That knowledge flows directly into future American projects, quietly, efficiently. The Soviets see the outlines of what is coming before the public does. A reusable spacecraft that launches like a rocket but lands like a plane. A system that treats space not as a one-way journey, but as a domain of routine operations. Years later, when the Space Shuttle finally flies, Soviet veterans will recognize its DNA immediately. Wings, heat tiles, a piloted glide back to Earth. They will know where it came from.
The X-15 program officially ends in 1968, its record books filled with numbers that still sound unreal. Mach 6.7, altitudes over 100 kilometers, dozens of flights beyond the edge of space, 13 pilots earning astronaut wings, not in capsules, but in an aircraft. Publicly, the world remembers Apollo. Privately, Soviet planners remember the X-15. Because Apollo was about flags and footprints, the X-15 was about capability. It proved that the boundary between air and space was not a wall, but a door, and the Americans had learned to open it, step through, and come back at will. In later years, Soviet pilots would speak of the X-15 with a mixture of respect and regret, not because it threatened them directly, but because it showed what might have been possible under different conditions. One retired test pilot, speaking decades later, summed it up simply. They did not just build a machine, they built a future. And on March 6th, when an American pilot flew higher than any aircraft had ever gone before, leaving the sky behind and returning on wings, the Soviet Union understood something fundamental. The next war would not be fought only over land or sea. It would be fought over altitude, control, and the space in between.